Hey, it's Jeremy from jeremy.net. I am a comic book artist, writer, creator, self publisher, and I share my creative process here with you online. If you enjoy this channel, would like to join our community, get additional bonus live streams twice a month, you can become a Patreon subscriber at patreon.com/GERIMI. For as little as $2 a month, become part of our community, get access to a Patreon exclusive Discord server, an online archive to read my comics digitally. And as I said before, we do bonus live streams twice a month. We've got one we're going to be doing tomorrow, 7:30 Pacific Standard Time, Monday night. If you'd like to get a free digital sketchbook, work in progress animated GIFs delivered right to your inbox, blog posts about what I'm reading, what I'm watching, what's inspiring me creatively, get signed up for my free monthly newsletter at newsletter.jeremy.net. And if you'd like to purchase physical copies of my comic books, or if you read digitally on Kindle, you can go to amazon.jeremy.net. They'll forward you to my Amazon author page. Pick these up. All right. So I see we've already got some people in the chat. I see my buddy Dan Plagle is here. He's excited. He's hyped. He said, "Let's do this." All right, Dan. I hope you're doing well. I'm glad that I hope you've got that energy for your work as well, and you're getting some stuff done. Always wishing positive vibes to my buddy Dan. He's had some health struggles as of recent years, and glad to see him always at it, being creative. All right, so today I was going to do a bit of drawing and sketching. I'm doing some studies from Walt Reed's The Figure. I also have some Andrew Loomis and some George Bridgman. And these studies are about proportion. And anyone who's been watching my live stream for any period of time knows that proportion is one of my weaknesses. It is my kryptonite. If I do not pay attention to what I'm doing, the proportions for any of my drawings will just get really wonky and really crappy. And it's one thing to be cartooning and to intentionally distort and exaggerate, or to have a stylistic, change that makes proportions not necessarily, realistic. But it's another thing to just be drawing and for things to just look off, a limb too long, a head squished too much. And what I wanted to get to, and what we're going to just dive into, is fixing stick figures at the gesture, fixing proportions. I'm just going to write here at the top. Fixing proportions at the stick figure stage. And it bothers me as a designer that I've got an orphan here. And why do I say stick figure stage and not the gesture stage? Because for some people, gesture can be a lot of sweeping arcs, full of energy, and you're trying to capture all of that energy of the figure and the rhythms of everything that the figure is doing. So gesture can be a lot more scribbly, and a lot more loose. However, this is not something. I have an approach that's slightly different, and this is one of those. This is what works for me. I'm not saying that this is a law for everyone and that everyone should draw the way that I'm drawing, but I'm trying to explain to you how I approach some of these figure drawing problems, and maybe you'll find something that's a little bit unconventional, that is not necessarily part of the what you've been taught before in your process of learning to draw, but something that helps me that you might say, "Oh, let me give that a try." So here's gesture. And what I like to do is I like to just do stick figures. Why do I like to do stick figures? Simply because no matter where you are creatively in terms of your skill, everyone can draw stick figures. Pardon me for a moment. Okay. No matter where you are in your artistic skill, everyone can draw stick figures. We draw stick figures as children. Um, and the idea is that if you can convey these more complex ideas of gesture and flow with just a simple single line or one or two lines, then when you build on top of that, a, it'll be cleaner and leave you more room to draw on top of it, but b, it's like it's the most simplified version, and it allows you to kind of get at the essence of what you're doing. So for me, if I were drawing this figure, I like to create a very, very faint line that represents the height of the entire figure. And we know if we're choosing to use 8 heads high proportion, I should probably draw this on another layer in case I need to turn it on or off. If we're drawing at 8 heads high proportion, and I think one of the diagrams I have has this in there, but the upper body is 4 heads high down to the bottom of the pelvis. The lower body is 4 heads high, the legs. So what I like to do is simply say, start at the base of the pelvis, and then just a simple stick figure leg going one way, simple stick figure leg going out slightly farther, pelvis tilted in. And sometimes I will draw this as 2 separate pieces to try and specifically get the angle, the tilt between the pelvis and the torso. Sometimes, well, actually, you know what? I'll leave those lines there. But sometimes what I'll do is I'll just draw it as a slightly curving rectangle and just try to draw it all as one piece to try and help me keep the thing looking and feeling whole. Then one arm coming down, the other arm, it's almost like I'll start with where the wrist is, kind of just below the belt line, and I'll sort of reverse engineer back up into where the torso is. And I'll also tell you, I did exaggerate this tilt of the shoulder. Looking at that reference, which this is Walt Reed, by the way, from the book Walt Reed, The Figure. Let's see here. And I see James is in the chat. Hey, James, how you doing? I'm just going over some proportion notes. It says the torso is sort of a pillow shape. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because there's lots of different ways of constructing the torso. You can construct it. I like blocks because it gives me more structure. Some people like pillows, kind of like the flour sack test that people do in animation. Some people like doing an egg shape for the rib cage. Some people There's one other one that I was about to think of. But yeah, the point being is that, you can do it as blocks, a single block. There's a variety of ways of thinking of it. And for me, it's simply what helps with the drawing that I'm doing at the moment. Because there's times when that rigid box structure that I tend towards and prefer, there's times when that really just ruins a drawing. And at those times, I'm like, all right, I guess I'm doing a pillow shape, or I guess I'm using an egg. Now, see, this is the thing right here at this stage. I look at this and I have where my head should be, and I know where my pelvis should be. So this head is telling me that I've made the rib cage too tall. So I can come back in here and just cut it down by about the length of the neck. Throw that neck in there. Give some shoulders coming down a little bit. And then drop so that the arms are starting down here. And I'm only going to erase this lightly. I'm going to leave those there kind of as after remembrances of what I started doing. In fact, I should probably have switched to red to make those changes, because that is the whole point of this. You start with a simple stick figure, and before you even get into, like, by the time I'm going in here and I'm starting to create simple structures, by the time I'm doing this stage, this is when I'm fixing and adapting and saying, oh, wait, this form should be facing this way. This should be longer. This should be shorter. This is the stage where I am making corrections. And making these corrections at this early stage of a drawing will save you so much time later on. Because then you really can focus on just anatomy and character and storytelling and lighting. You can focus on all those other things if you make these simple fixes at a stage like this. That hand coming down. So that's probably enough. Let's move on to another example. Because, like I said, this is about making adjustments at a stick figure stage. So there's not much point I don't want to go forward and render this into a finished drawing. I just kind of want to give you guys an idea of what I'm thinking in terms of this approach. And I see Martin's in the chat. Good afternoon, brother. Same to you. Good to see you. All right. Suretsi here. Also, everyone's rolling in. Good to see you guys. Thanks for joining me. Thanks for joining us. So let's take a look at another drawing. I have this in my little folder of master studies. So here's another Walt Reed with a pose that's a little bit more dynamic. And I am going to, almost like I'm titling this session, seeing. So with this one now, again, I like to start with a simple line to define the entire height of the figure. because that way I always know in the middle is where the base of the pelvis is going to be. Now from here, he's bent over, which means the head isn't going to reach this height. Let's say he's bending over a little bit, so his head the top might be a little bit lower, and create a simple line that represents sort of the spine, but the entire flow of his upper body. And then let's anchor that with this line here, which is the base of the pelvis. That's what this represents. But from here, I'm going to have one thigh go out this way. Then the knee come down to the lower leg. The other one, you can drop an arc over here. This one coming more towards the viewer, but not foreshortened, just coming more straight down as opposed to going out like he's doing kind of not splits, but kind of like a cowboy stance. Instead, he's just coming, it's like it's coming down and slightly forward. But his lower leg, that one is jutting out, and that one does stick out a little bit lower. And when I say lower, I look at stuff like, where does the heel hit the ground? Now, if I look comparatively on these two drawings, the heel will hit the ground. Be great if I could draw a straight line, wouldn't it? Not at the bottom of the foot. Like these toes are higher up than those toes. So really, I can just, you know what? I might as well leave those there. Why not? Those lines help explain the ideas I'm chasing. So I might have made this one, the foot come down a little too far. Maybe the ankle is up here. So that the foot will kind of just be maybe that far. But again, it's just a little line. It's just a stick. And I am drawing with the side of my stylus, but this is the same approach I would take if I were drawing with traditional media, where I'm drawing with pencil, where I'm using more tone than I am hard lines. Now, from here, I'm kind of ballparking where the head is versus the torso. And I could start by drawing the torso first, but instead I know, basically that the head is going to be 1/4 of this entire height. So let's say I block in the head like that. Now, because I know that the shoulders, they're leaning forward. So the shoulders are up a little bit. You can even see this in the little thumbnail of me, that if I lean forward like this, I'm leaning forward more than the figure in that drawing, but you can see that my shoulders are about level. If I come back just a little bit, they're about level with the base of my nose. So as opposed to just being down here below my head completely, when I'm leaning forward, the shoulders are up. If I lean forward extreme, my shoulders at the highest point are level with the bottom of my eyes. If you can see the line that I'm making here in the little thumbnail on the side, you look at where my shoulder is, you look at the base of my eyes. So I can actually use this to help me block in the rest of the figure by drawing the head in first up there, and then just saying, all right, have the shoulder cut in here. If anything, I look at this and I feel like that head is probably, well, I want to say that the head needs to be a little bit lower. Like I know I lowered it somewhat, but it feels like it needs to be lower. I look at this and my instinct, well, the whole point of me doing studies like this, is that my instincts can be wrong a lot. In fact, that's kind of the big point of studies, is to test your instincts, to test what you do just on your own without, you know, any guidance, and then say, "Oh, wait, where are the places where I have bad habits that I need to break?" For me, that's the point of this, is breaking bad habits. And again, you can look over and just say, here is the fist. If you were to just draw a line across the figure, that fist is about where his waist is. So I can do the same thing over here. Now, foreshortening is not something you can do well with stick figures, but you can just make it a little bit more detailed and go from a stick figure to a simple volume. So, like, I kind of rounded this out to make it more of a sphere. You can kind of see a little bit of a cylinder that I'm drawing the rest of that upper arm. Let's see here. And that is a very good point. James in the chat says, studies aren't the most exciting thing to do, but they help. Um, well, it's true. They're not exciting, and a lot of people resist them because they feel like homework. For me, they feel very meditative. They feel very relaxing. When I do studies, I just feel like it's not so much I'm turning my mind off as it is I'm turning my mind inward. And I'm really trying to change or challenge my notions of volume and structure. So see, at this point, I don't really see like I have much problems with the lower body proportions. It was really just the upper body that really needed a little bit of tweaking. Um, I'm almost ready to move on from this one, but I am gonna sort of just finish off the simple volumes that are here before we move on to the next one. I am curious to hear from you guys. What are the kinds of exercises that you do to help you improve your practice? Because I mean, part of the reason I share a lot of these exercises, what the reason why I share so much of the figure drawing work that I do, is because I feel like those are the things that are going to allow me to make the type of art that I want to make. Most artists tend to only show the really cool finished piece that they do. And they don't necessarily show, and, I mean, in the same way that studies aren't always sexy to do, they're not necessarily sexy to share either. You know, a lot of people don't necessarily want to sit and watch videos of saying, "Oh, hey, there's all this other stuff you have to do in order to make good art." Um, or at least to make art where you have control over it, because you can make good art without doing studies like this, but it's almost like the art is from the expression that you're making. It's not from having control over your craft, which is what I'm trying to do. And a lot of times people don't necessarily want to see, or they aren't interested in all of that extra work that goes into it. But we're always saying, well, how do I get good? That's the whole question. How do you get good? Um, and for me, it's doing studies like this. Doing studies like this, taking figure drawing classes, um, you know, having a collection of art books for reference to look up all kinds of details. All right, that's enough because I'm going to just get caught up in just rendering. Let's see here. So that's a good question. James asks, is bad art a result of lack of practice or a result of lack of skill? Um, well, I would say lack of practice is lack of skill. And because I think a lot of people think I'm reading into your question, and what I'm projecting is when you say lack of skill, I'm almost thinking lack of talent, because a lot of people think of talent as, an artist is talented, either they have it or they don't. And they have that magical thing that allows them to make whatever they're going to make. Because skill is not talent. Skill is just is the practice. So skill is practice, practice is skill. Skill is the result of practice. You start out unskilled, you practice, you gain skills. And in terms of what makes bad art, uh, well, that's tricky only in the sense that very skilled and very talented artists do make bad art. Um, and bad art can be the result of, you're having a bad day creatively, the ideas aren't coming. It can be from lack of research or reference, which that's a whole separate topic. I find a lot of times if I'm doing a piece and it's really fighting me, that I realize, oh, I just don't know what the thing I'm trying to draw looks like. And if I go get some reference of an environment, or if I light an object myself, or if I take my little figures and light them, or just look at an anatomy book and say, oh, I'm trying to draw something, and they look like their neck is broken because that's not really the angle their neck would be for the pose I'm doing. There's a wide variety of things that can cause bad art that do not mean that you are a bad artist. Sometimes it's that the idea isn't particularly interesting. Sometimes it's that the composition of what you're doing isn't interesting. You've got a really interesting idea, but the composition is just sort of blah. Sometimes you have a really interesting composition, but it doesn't say anything. So the actual draftsmanship may actually be pretty good, but the concept itself is not exciting to the point where you're just like, why did they even make this? It's not because they're a bad artist. There's a variety of things that make up whether a piece is good or bad. And let us not forget that art is hugely subjective. Every piece of art you've ever seen that you hate is somebody else's favorite work. Somebody loves that, has it hanging on their wall, and you're like, God, really? I mean, that's why comic fans love to fight about who's your favorite hero. Which hero? Who would win in this fight? Who sucks? Who's awesome? It's subjective. It's about what speaks to the individual. I mean, are there some things that people can say unilaterally lack a particular piece of craft or quality? I think that that's true. There's times when there's work that comes out and everyone says, this was not well done, and these are the reasons why, and these are the things it's missing. That can still be true, and it can still be someone else's favorite work of art. So let's see here. Soretzi's got some interesting points here. So he says, for me, I think I've said before here, Jeremy, doing completed work is best for developing your art. I would say I disagree with you, my brother, in the endless practice. He says, for instance, if you had a cover to do for your new book and sequential pages, you would benefit more by redrawing those things over and over again until you perfect it. I think you would get more benefit from that than from endless construction practice. Well, I do actually. It's not that I don't 100% disagree with you. I think that you learn a tremendous amount by just making. Um, Making work teaches you the most. But the reason for me where study comes in and why I feel like it's important is when you've made work for a number of years and you don't seem like you're improving. And that was the wall that I hit, where it didn't seem like there was any real growth. And I realized it's because I had not mastered the fundamentals. And that's when I started looking at that's when I started getting back into figure drawing classes. That's when I started looking at works of the old masters, and that was actually probably something that was inspired by the instructors in the classes that I was taking. Um, and the point is that when you're looking to actually understand why your art does not do what it's doing, it's one thing to simply draw something, because I do the same thing with my studies that you do with, say, a cover you're working on. You draw it, it's not right. So you try to fix it and you improve it and you change elements. But when you keep trying to change elements and it doesn't get better and you don't understand why it's not good, that's where I would say looking at masterworks or doing studies from either from life, doing studies, having a model or reference, doing studies from anatomy books, and actually trying to see what the thing you're trying to draw looks like. I think you probably, I've seen your work. You're an advanced enough artist that you have a very good sense of what it is you're going for in any given drawing. And from that, you can look at it and say, all right, I know why. When a piece isn't working, you can diagnose it. But what I'm speaking towards is the idea of, and I don't know if you've ever been in the position where you could not diagnose a piece, but that's more of what I'm speaking to when it comes to something as simple as trying to fix proportion, whether it's anatomy studies or what have you, is the most important talent an artist can have is the ability to diagnose their own work. And I don't know if you've ever been in a situation where you couldn't diagnose your own work, but for me, learning how to look at my work, analyze what isn't working, identify it, and then go through rounds of revisions and corrections is like it's an essential skill. And even this exercise that I'm doing in terms of like trying to draw these simple stick figures and move the proportions around at this stick figure stage, this to me is me practicing that tool. And you could practice this tool while working on a cover. But if I practice it while I'm working on a cover, I'm not necessarily thinking about just the exercise. I'm thinking about the deadline of the cover, and I'm not really trying to make corrections. I'm thinking about just getting the job done. And I'm not thinking about like I'm removing the emotional baggage that you bring with your own finished work. When you're doing something where you're just doing a study, you're kind of emotionally detached from it because it's not some beautiful thing out of your sketchbook that you're trying to bring to life. It's just I'm like right now, I'm just sketching off of a Bridgman sketch. If it sucks, who cares? Um, Whereas for a lot of artists really get hung up when their work is not coming out the way they want, and they view it as somehow an extension of like an internal failure of self. And studies, I think, are a really good way around that because you're just using knowledge that someone else has to work through a problem. So I respect your disagreement. I still stand by doing studies as a way of helping one improve, but I would say try both. Who knows? If someone, I'm not saying that to you. I know that your way in terms of just working on pieces and working on them, that's the direction you're going. But I'm saying for anyone else that is kind of on the fence, try just doing finished pieces and making corrections, you know? And then also try doing studies either of, for me, the most important thing is going to figure drawing classes. And I don't know how much time you've spent, sitting in front of live models in classes, but that more than anything, I mean, more than doing studies from a particular book or instructor, sitting in a classroom with a live model and doing studies from that live model, that has helped me improve my work more than anything else. I don't know how you feel about figure drawing classes. Let's see here. All right, let me scroll back up. So James says one comic I read had 3D models for the characters. He said interesting idea, but they didn't look good. I have seen comics with that were done with 3D, and they were interesting, but they looked to me more like it looked like the 3D of it was almost like a gimmick. Because I feel like for comics, what we're coming to them for is illustration. We're coming for that look, whether it's a painted comic, whether it's done traditionally or digitally. We're looking for that kind of expressiveness that is hard to get from a 3D model. Although these days, if you were to look at something like, I wrote a blog post on Patreon lately, a review of Blue Eye Samurai on Netflix. And I remember listening to one of the behind the scenes videos, and they said their goal was to make it look like a moving painting. And if you were to take Blue Eyed Samurai and make a comic out of that, just using stills from that show, that to me feels like that could work. But that is a very specific type of 3D rendering. You could also say maybe apply the same thing to something like um, I haven't watched all of Arcane. I've only watched like I think the first two episodes. But that League of Legends Netflix animated series, which again, it's got that very Riot Games style to it, which is more illustrative than just a 3D model. So let's see here. James also said, I can see why most artists do 2D. And honestly, that's just a matter of speed. Um, in terms of doing a whole comic in 3D, in theory, if you've got the whole character in 3D models and you're really good at posing, you could design the character once and then just pose him panel after panel after panel. But it still feels like to me in the long run, that's going to be just as long as drawing it, if not longer. And the drawing to me feels like it's what's interesting about the act of making art. So Suretsi says, I still have not mastered the fundamentals. Your construction process is much better than mine. By the way, your work is fantastic, man. It's definitely not a competition. He says, may I ask, did you copy any professionals that inspired you? Well, this is an interesting question because I've been thinking about doing a video for a very, very long time about just who my artistic influences are. It's going to take me a while to go through this before I catch up to the rest of the chat. So I'll try to make this quick. But when I first got into comics, I came in. Most people come in. A lot of people came in as fans of John Byrne, and they came in as fans of his Fantastic Four run or his Uncanny X-Men run. For me, as weird as it is, the run of John Byrne that brought me to comics was West Coast Avengers. I started reading right when he began his run with a storyline called Vision Quest, which they kind of played with in the Avengers movies and in WandaVision with him coming with his mind erased and there being a version of the Vision that is all white brain memory has the memories, but the emotions are all gone. Anyway, I started out coming in with John Byrne, whose work is very, very constructed and solid. And then not long after that, I discovered Walt Simonson at my local comic shop. They actually had a raffle, and one of the things they gave away was the very first um, Epic Comics line version of Walt Simonson's Star Slammers. And that I still have that copy, and to this day, that is one of my all-time favorite comics. I enjoyed that more than Star Wars. Basically, in getting to know comics, for me, my Mount Rushmore of comic creators that I'm inspired by, it started out John Byrne, Walt Simonson, then Frank Miller, and then Howard Chaykin. So those were my guys growing up. And then when I got into high school, I kind of found that I loved a lot of different comic artists. I loved all kinds of styles. I loved painted comics. I loved very scratchy and scribbly comics. I loved really sharp line, like, Kevin Nolan comics. I loved everything. And I was kind of like I was frustrated in a way because I didn't know who to be inspired by. And this is probably around the time the Image Founders came out, because you did mention being influenced by Todd McFarlane. I was kind of all over the map in terms of who I was influenced by, and that includes the Image Founders. And I loved all of these different styles. And then I discovered Bill Sienkiewicz. And Bill Sienkiewicz, I would say, still remains my favorite comic creator. And, if you're familiar with this work, you can see why, because I love a lot of different styles and a lot of different influences. And Bill Sienkiewicz, along with Howard Chaykin, were both guys who said, stop looking at comic art. Go look at fine art. They said, if you want to write, don't read comics. Go read like literature. So, both like, I mean, Bill Sienkiewicz is the one who got me to start looking at Gustav Klimt and Egon Schiele. So they sort of opened up a much broader, much wider door for me in terms of just looking at a variety of art. But specifically with Bill Sienkiewicz, the idea that, he can have not just in the same, he can have painting living next to line drawing, living next to like little sculptural things coming up off of the page, along with like sort of copier photo manipulation. He can have all of that on this, not just in the the same comic. He'll have it all on the same page, depending on the context and whether it fits and works. And that just blew my mind. That sort of rewired my brain. Now, beyond that, I started getting into other artists after that. Other painted artists, Dave McKean, who did all the Sandman covers. He has a great series called, not series, but a great book called Cages that he published from Tundra Comics. David Mack from Kabuki fame, creator of Echo, the character that was on the Daredevil spinoff. But the artist, I would say, that after Bill Sienkiewicz that had a, I don't want to, I'm trying to think of a way to phrase this. It's not that he had a influence on me, but it's Ashley Wood. And I love Ashley Wood's work, but I have a weird relationship with it in that over the time that I became a fan of Bill Sienkiewicz, or post that time, in my head, I didn't want to ape what Bill Sienkiewicz did. And by the way, what I'm doing here is I realized I got too wrapped up in drawing this drawing, and I really lost the stick figure of it. So I'm just going to draw a simple stick figure here on the side, because this is really the point of what I'm doing here, is this little stick figure-y, this is the point when you should be fixing your proportions. But anyway, I had a picture in my mind of what I wanted my artwork to look like when I had the skill to draw it. So I couldn't draw as well as I wanted to do it, but I knew what I wanted it to look like. And when I discovered Ashley Wood's work, it was like, oh, he's the artist I want to be. He's literally doing what I want to do. But I think we all know that while it's common for many artists to be inspired by other comic artists and even to be a bit of a clone of them for a while. You don't want to just ape somebody else's style. So I didn't know for a long time. It gave me an identity crisis, and this is probably when I was maybe out of college, early 20s. Sort of like, I don't know what to do because I want to be this artist, but this artist already exists. And I went through a bunch of periods of trying to figure stuff out. And it still had there's a reason why my work doesn't look very painterly. And I'm getting to that, which is one day when I was working on my first graphic novel, I went to my bookcase and I went to look at how Ashley Wood drew a certain scene in his book Pop Bot, because I had a similar composition and a similar emotional beat. And I just walked halfway over to my bookshelf and I just stopped and I said, I'm not Ashley Wood. I need to figure this out on my own, which goes back to what you were saying, Suretzi. At a certain point, you have to figure out on your own what it is you want to do and how to do it. But what I realized at that point, I said, okay, if I'm not going to copy what Ashley Wood's doing, then how do I figure out how to do what I want to do? And I realized that if you look at my influences, if you look at those major later influences, Bill Sienkiewicz, Ashley Wood, David Mack, what do they have in common? And what they have in common is that their actual draftsmanship underneath all of the painting and the stylized lines and the splashy ink work and line work and the distorted figures, underneath all of that, they have such a mastery of draftsmanship and structural drawing that they can let that expressiveness go free. They can just let it go and wander. They still have the control, the actual craft to convey something, and to convey it with a sense of not photorealism, but to present them as authentic to the world that they're drawing. And that's what led me to studying Bridgman and Andrew Loomis and Walt Reed, because I felt like having such a control over the structural elements of drawing would give me eventually the figurative strength to do whatever I want, no matter how wild, no matter what I do stylistically on top of it. And that led me down a path of studying these artists. So in a way, it's that really expressive stylistic art that led me to where I am now. All right, that was a long rant, and I knew it was going to be a long rant. I mean, it's something that I've thought about making a whole video of. So let me just go through the comments real quick. And so there's the question about my process for studying construction. Let me get caught up here with you guys. So James says, yeah, I'm not really worried if a study sketch sucks. I refine them when I notice something's off. Pardon me. Hang on. Yeah. Right. Yeah. And for me, that was the point of this particular video, is me looking at ways in which I try to fix sketches when they're off. And kind of just sharing that process and the thoughts that it might be helpful. And James says, I may want to look into ways to approach studies. So Suretzi says, I originally thought I should learn on my own and create on my own way. So I watched a Todd McFarlane video. And he said, learn not just from nature and life, but learn from artists in the industry. So do you learn from industry artists or try to go it alone? Well, I think the rant there, definitely I don't go at my own. Number one thing is, I don't know with figure drawing classes. I don't know if figure drawing classes have ever been a thing you've ever been into being with a live model. That is a big piece of studying for me. And then on top of that, I've got a pretty big library of art books. Like, I look at John Singer Sargent. I just recently, a really good friend of my wife and I, she got me a book of the complete works of Diego Velázquez for my birthday, and that book is just amazing and beautiful. I've got a few different books on Gustav Klimt because I mentioned he's one of my big influences. I've got several Michelangelo books. I've got I think 2 or 3 books just on the Sistine Chapel alone. Let's see here. So yeah, it's definitely yeah. I look at a lot of different artists, and I don't look at too many comic artists these days. I like listening to comic artists talk about their process. Like I like listening whenever Ryan Benjamin is on Proco or on David Finch's channel. I like listening to him talk. Just the other day, I literally spent I think 8 hours just drawing and listening to Brian Stelfreeze on David Finch's channel because each one was like a 2 hour plus video. And I would just listen to, they were just painting together. It was like him, David Finch, and the guy Eric, I guess he does his, David Finch does his podcast with, and just listen to them paint and talk process and, it's stuff like that. So I still listen to those artists. But I'd say I am more interested these days in looking at artists outside of comics. And that's not because I don't or have something against, it's not because I have something against comic artists. It's because looking at either the old masters in terms of Italian Renaissance drawing and painting, or looking at early American illustration, like say Howard Pyle, Norman Rockwell, of course, Leyendecker, a lot of early Albert Dorn, Walt Reed. Walt Reed would be in that category. A lot of these guys have art books, but those people who have come before, they've solved all of the drawing problems. We act like every drawing problem we have is new. No, there's people who've already figured out all of the answers, and they've written the answers down. It's just people don't go look for them. So I'm more interested in studying the illustrators outside of comics that are specifically just have educational material and then try to learn what I can from that and then bring it back and apply it to my work. And I see Paul, great cartoonist, comic creator Paul Pate in the chat, says, just want to stop by and say hi. And he says, the man with the never-ending last name, Bill S. is awesome. Yeah, I love me some Sienkiewicz. And I'll tell you, I've had a chance to meet him in person a few different times. Really good, a friend of mine, Sue Carlin, she's a journalist, but I met her in a figure drawing class, and she heard me talking to somebody else about how Sienkiewicz was one of my favorite artists. And she said, hold on a minute. And then she just went, got her phone, called. She knows Bill. She's good friends with him. She just called, put me on the phone with him. And it was so weird to be put on the phone with one of your heroes and just be like, you heard me talking and saying how much I love your work and how influential it's been on me. He's super sweet, super kind. I've met him in person at conventions a few times, and he's just awesome. If you've ever seen an interview with him, he's like that in real life. He's just this down to earth, casual, kind of fun, goofy guy. And it's you look at him and it's wow, you don't act like you're a genius, but you're such a genius. He's like a normal human being, but amazing stuff just comes out of his mind and his hands and just, dude, yeah, he's awesome. All right, enough of that. So Soretzi says, now I see what you're struggling with, Jeremy. It's this wide acceptance of art. So you don't have a clear view of what you want to portray. He says, and thus all you need then is how to best go about portraying this. Soretzi says, I love realism, so I was attracted to Jim Lee and the like. Once I understood what he was doing and who influenced him and what they were trying to do, then I understood what I wanted to do. It wasn't about them anymore. It was about the things I liked and not wanted, the things I liked and and not want Jim or anyone else would do. He said, this discussion actually made me understand myself a little more. So thank you for the rant, which is always good since we learn. He said, and don't get me wrong, All I did was still lives, and then graduated to live figure drawings. He said, I have and do a lot of studies too. It is continual. It's a good point. He said, and I understand that it's about the finished work for me, as once I get it right, I can recreate it, which leads me to ask you a question. I asked leads me to a leads me to a question you asked. I can break down my own work and figure out what is wrong. Um, the answer is usually because of training. Well, you know what? I mean, I'm glad that you took something away from this because that's the other thing. I mean, I always have the thing. Sometimes when people have differing opinions on stuff, it turns into a whole, who's right and who's wrong. And I always just feel like everyone's path through the creative process is different. And I can totally see where you're coming from in having a strong sense of what it is that you want. And you're right. Because I got to a point, and a large part of it was finding out that someone else was already doing exactly what I wanted to do, and that made me question what I want to do. But figuring out and knowing what you want, there's two things in there for me that are kind of interesting to unpack. And one is that I actually like you when you said it for you, it's about the finished artwork. When I started taking figure drawing classes, so I went to a fine art school. And when I say fine art school, I mean like conceptual art and video installations and stuff like that. And the work that people were doing there, I was just a regular illustrator, but I was there on an athletic scholarship. So, I mean, I went to UCLA, and while the school itself, the fine art program, was not geared towards, they didn't have anything like an illustration program. But because I was there as a student athlete, I couldn't just transfer to, say, art center because I was on a scholarship and I could not afford college if I were not on a scholarship. And art center does not have a track team, so I would have been able to do that. Um, Point being is that, and I didn't really start studying draftsmanship with any type of real seriousness until like kind of my junior and senior year when I started taking animation classes in the film program. And then I was like, oh, these people actually know how to draw, because everyone else is just about what are you trying to say? No one cares whether you actually have the craft to say it. Um, that is a long way of me trying to get to the point that when I started studying figures and figure drawing, it was for myself because I wanted to be a better artist. And this was well after college. I mean, I was probably in my I want to say I was in probably my late 20s when I really started taking figure drawing classes on my own. And at first it was just to get better. But over time, I have fallen in love with the act of studying. Like remember before when I said how it's kind of meditative? For me, I can draw from the figure for hours, knowing that I'm not going to have a finished piece of work or a cover. Like just the act of studying the figure for the sake of studying, that to me, it's not the only thing that I'm interested in, but it is something that I learned over time while taking figure drawing classes. I learned a love of just studying the process. Um, and that was something that I had never really gotten in art school. They in the same way were kind of like it's about the finished work. I mean, unless you are a conceptual artist and you're doing work about process. Let's see here. Hang on, I gotta put my phone on mute. There we go. Unless you're studying the process, unless you're doing a piece of work about process, people aren't really studying process. And I've come to fall in love with the process. So the idea of making something, pardon me, I'm sorry, my throat is just all over the place. It's killing me. Um, all of this and the idea of doing endless studies, it's a joy to me. It's relaxing. It's comforting to me. Um, but yeah, that idea of it also having that secondary application of just the tool to diagnose your work, to repair and correct whatever you're doing. By the way, I think we're going to wrap things up very shortly. I've got one more in here. Here's an Andrew Loomis piece because we did a little Bridgman. We did some Loomis. Not some Loomis. We did some Bridgman. We did some Walt Reed. I think I should throw in some Loomis here, as long as I'm talking about artists whose work I've studied. And Soretzi says, I did go to the School of Visual Arts in New York. Okay, see, now that's amazing. Is that the school where David Mazzucchelli teaches and Will Eisner used to teach a long time ago? And I think Klaus Janson is. Am I thinking of the right school where they have a specifically a comics creation course, and like Klaus Janson teaches there, David Mazzucchelli. Um, let's see here. But anyway, I envy you. That sounds like an amazing place to go. If it's the program that I'm thinking of. Let's see here. So James says, I can see how comic art can be useful as reference. Maybe there's an article of clothing that you like or a facial expression. I don't really look at comic art when doing surreal stuff, though. I have found that some fine art has been helpful in that regard. Well, that's interesting because when I think of looking at other artists' work for inspiration, when I think of reference, I think of looking at photographs or staging photographs of real objects. That's what I think of for reference. When I think of inspiration, that's when I think of other artists. And then I'm thinking about looking at what are the tools that they use to solve a similar creative problem, whether that problem is a problem of lighting. Um, I look at other artists, whether comic book or traditional, for how did they approach this, not so much what does this look like. So it might be lighting, it might be composition, um, like crowd scenes. I'm like, oh, how did a like as opposed to looking at a photograph of a bunch of crowds, like at a carnival or at a at a conference or something. I might look at them and say, all right, how I might want that's a place where I would look at another artist and say, well, how do they separate these large crowds of people into something that is readable? I mean, do they use planes of color? How do they mask all of the figures together? How much detail do they put into this? Um, are they just separated into blocks of value, like one mass of people, a group of silhouettes is darker, and then as you move backwards, each mass gets slightly lighter, but they still feel like collective masses. Is there like a tree nearby that's casting shade over a block of them and using that to break them up? Things like that. Or like in the instance you said in terms of cloth and clothing, I may look at how much detail they put into the clothing. Or actually sculpture. Sculpture is something I really like to look at for clothing because sculpture feels very, very solid, which is one of the things I'm always chasing. But at the same time, it's art, but it's three-dimensional. So a person's hand made decisions about what this thing looks like, and they eliminated details that would be in reality because a sculpture isn't going to have every single piece of light and dark and every little wrinkle that would be in a piece of fabric. But it's still going to overall give you the sense of what that cloth or that cape or that dress felt like. So sculpture for me is a good thing to look at. Let's see here. So Suretse says, I don't know who teaches there now, but when I was there were many pros, and one notable one was Joe Quesada himself. He said, at the time, there were only a tertiary institute that offered a bachelor's degree in cartooning. He said, my major was actually animation, even though I applied for and was accepted to the cartooning program. So I switched because I thought animation was harder. Big mistake. I don't know. I mean, I think animation is harder. Let's see here. He said, I'm a college dropout and did not graduate. No shame in that because I mean, as artists, no one looks at your degree. Everyone just looks at your portfolio, and the work, the body of work that you produce. That's all that matters. Let's see. He said, as for clothing, a teacher at IADT in Tampa, Florida, told me that doing a fashion design class is good for that. And I see my boy John Ursick in the chat. He says, hi, Jeremy, just checking things out today. We're going to be wrapping up shortly. I'm just doing some proportion stick figure studies. And Suretse says, I learned I hate animation. I won't say that I, quote unquote, I won't say that I hate animation, but I I thought that animation was going to be my salvation artistically because and it turned out it was not. Um, so I went to college in the late 90s. So as you know, that was when the comic book industry was going through its bust. Um, the post nine, the post image boom crash that the industry went through. I was in college during that time, and while I went into college thinking, "Oh, well, I want to make comics," 2 years in, I was like, we're back to that old question, people, that old joke about the comic book industry has been dying for like 50 years, where people are wondering whether, there's even going to be an industry. And I thought, well, I'm gonna need to figure out what to do when I get out of school. And the animation program at UCLA is actually a graduate program. You cannot get an undergraduate degree in animation from UCLA, at least at the time that I went there. I don't know if they've changed that. It's part of the film school, and you cannot get an undergraduate degree. But they do open the beginning classes. So the beginning animation, the storyboard class, and then the second level animation class. You can take those classes. Um, if you have basically I think you just have to have like a portfolio review to see if you actually have the skill to do it. Um, and being a fine art major, I could just use my fine art electives for animation, which is what I did. And I was like, okay, I'm drawing, I'm enjoying this. I got to have an internship at Nickelodeon, which was fantastic. But when I got out of, I couldn't get a degree in it, and I was told that basically the dean of the animation program strongly encouraged me to apply for the graduate school in animation. And the reason why I didn't was money, because I was on scholarship. That's the only reason why I was even able to afford college. I would not have been able to afford. I did not want to go. I still had to go into get loans just to pay for my room and board because my scholarship covered tuition and books. Did not. It wasn't a full ride. So I still had student loans, but they just fortunately wasn't the tens of thousands of dollars that a lot of people come out of college with. But I did not want to go deeper in debt when I knew that I kind of figured, well, I don't really need the degree in order to be an artist. It's just a matter of like having a portfolio and getting it in front of people. But I could not get a job in animation to save my life. And I started making my own short animated films, and I was doing that for a while. And after about 3 or 4, like, I think I had one film that was it was like a 3-part short trilogy. So each piece was like a 5-minute film. No, each piece was like 3 minutes, and it ended up being like a total of like an 8-minute animated film. And after doing that, I made like one more like 5 or 6-minute short. And then I was like, I could tell these stories quicker if I was just doing comics. And that made me realize it's not, I do not hate animation, but I do find it tedious. And I was like, I'd really rather just storyboard this stuff and have someone else animate it. I don't really want to be an animator. Um, and then eventually I got a job in the toy industry doing packaging design and eventually switching to product design. And that's when, for my personal work, I just went back to making comics because it just felt like it was a more direct approach for me, which is interesting because I look at guys like my buddy Jim Lujan. I look at the work that Corey Kerr does, and they are able to produce great animation very quickly. And they've got like a very efficient workflow for their process. And in theory, I could just try to recalibrate my mind to learn how to do that. But I find just doing the storytelling with comics, it really comes down to what you enjoy doing. And that's the process that I have come to enjoy. So, but I mean, that's why there's different mediums. You know, not everyone has to do the same thing. Let's see here. So John says proportions with stick figures was difficult for me until I learned about the landmarks of the body. He says it's hard to tell where a limb ends if you don't know how the landmarks work. You know, very, very true. I mean, that's part of one of the things I enjoy. What I really love is the fact that like something as simple as for the foot, for me, learning that I could draw just the joints and where they turn, and I could do that for the foot here. I can say, okay, I've got the heel of the foot here, and then I've got that majority of the foot. I didn't even draw the whole triangle of the foot. I just drew one line for this piece and then one line for that piece, you know. And it's just, 1, 2 lines there that give us all that. But the idea of drawing the landmarks in the stick figure, you're so right. For each of these, I try to very clearly because if you really all the landmarks are is just drawing from joint to joint. And if you can figure out how to draw from one joint to another, the stick figure is just connecting those joints. That's all it is. Stick figure is just connecting those joints. That's all you're doing. It's very, very simple. But it takes a bit of practice to train your mind to see the figure that way. Let's see here. Oh, Sretzi says, I think slaves should do the actual animation work. I only really like character and background design. That was huge for me to understand about myself as well. Well, I mean, I hate to say it. It looks like they're trying to make AI take all of the actual animation work. And this is the weird thing. I don't like animating by hand. But I look at people who have done it, and I look at I watched some of Modern Day James's live streams where I was watching him doing animations of his own work. And Tonko Pajoa, I watch his YouTube channel, and he's an amazing animator, and he's making his own animated film. I look at people who do that, and I see how much they love the act of actually animating and creating the illusion of life. And I think that's a beautiful thing. In the same way that I like doing studies of figures. And even doing comics, people say comics seems extremely tedious. But for me, I love working out the storytelling from panel to panel and the composition of the entire page. And I see that there's people who look at that and they think that's tedious. I'm like, that makes sense to me, that we all have different things we're drawn to and different strengths and weaknesses, and that we're all drawn. We gravitate to the things that bring us the most joy. Let's see here. And John Ersick says, it was the same at USC. You couldn't do undergraduate degrees in animation, only graduate degree. And he says, I always wanted to do the grunt work of animation, but you'd have to go overseas to actually do that. And it's interesting because I do think like there's French animation studios. I've seen it, like, for instance, we were talking earlier about Blue Eye Samurai, and even though it's a 3D animated show, the animation I believe is being done in France, French animation studio. Um, and I think that there are places around the world besides just Asia, besides just Asian studios that are doing 2D animation. There are places. I mean, France, Canada. I'm sure there's other small Europe. A deer just walked outside my window. Sorry, it's kind of crazy. Um, anyway, yeah, there's all kinds of places where people get to do that. And it kind of sucks that we're in this environment where it is not economically feasible for people to make beautiful handcrafted animation here in the United States. Um, I mean, yeah, I know, I get it. It's entertainment business. It's not entertainment passion. I think that's one of the things that long-standing conflict between creativity and commerce, making something because it's beautiful as opposed to making something because it's profitable. But if you make something that's beautiful enough, the hope is that you will reap profits from it to allow you to make more beauty. That is the cycle that I think artists aspire to. Let's see here. John says, I landmark to the ankle because that's the length of the tibia and the heel moves. Well, I mean, I normally that is what I do. Like, if let me see where's some of the other one. The reason why I landmarked to the heel on this one is only because that is where I because I was using the heel as a measurement to compare to where, if you go from the bottom of the bottom of the torso and the buttocks to the knee and then go back, I tend to think of that as a triangle. But that's only in this pose because going back and group this. I'm sure there's some other ones in here where yeah, generally speaking, I tend to do what you're doing, where I will landmark the ankle instead. Let's see. Yeah, this one is a good example because it depends on the pose. But for instance, on this one, it's really that I have that termination of the lower leg in the ankle. That's the point that I'm usually landmarking to. But sometimes I will shift to the heel if it lines up with something else compositionally. So let's see here. And James says, "Yeah, my visual problems make it difficult for me to animate by hand." No, and that's another argument for using 3D to animate. Let's see here. And John says, I think there's a difference between fine art breakdown of the boy and animators breakdown of the body, where the fine artists look for tangents and negative space, and animators have to look for the functionality of the joints. Yes, absolutely. I mean, and taking those animation classes in college, that was the fundamental shifting of my understanding of art, because something that I kind of knew from studying comics in high school, because I'd been exposed to George Bridgman, even though I hadn't really dove deep into him when I was in high school. And I had Hogarth's Dynamic Anatomy, and I'd read How to Draw Comics the Marvel Way. But it wasn't until I was taking animation classes and I understood that animators needed to understand how to rotate the figure in their head, and they need to understand how to move joints in their head, in their imagination. They needed to be able to see it so that they could convey that. And that was something that up until college, I had not understood. I was still thinking in terms of flat 2D, you look into the picture plane and you're making a drawing. So it was all sort of like outline, outline, outline. It wasn't really until I was taking animation classes that I truly understood the concept of volume. And mind you, 3D animation did exist in the sense that I think Terminator 2 had already been out by the time I was in college. The Matrix came out while I was in college. 3D animation existed. But the idea of two-dimensional drawing and drawing those things and understanding them as three-dimensional objects moving in space. Like, have you ever seen that Richard Williams book, I can't remember if it's the Animator's Workshop, Animator's Handbook, or the Animator's Survival Kit. I can't remember the name of it, but the Richard Williams book on animation, that all of that fundamental studying of three-dimensional drawing, not 3D models, that was something that information existed, but no one had conveyed it or communicated it to me. I mean, that's kind of the upside, I think, of I'm not really for or against formal artistic training. I'm for gathering the knowledge you need to make the things that you want, and whatever path that takes you, whether it's studying under, getting a mentorship from a creator, whether it's going to an art school that teaches that, whether it's taking workshops with people, whether it's just watching a shit ton of YouTube videos or buying the right art books that have the information you need. So, to me, none of it matters. None of it is good or bad. It's just, do the tools help you get where you want to go? All right. And well, yeah, I think we're still talking on the joints there, but John says I do switch between the two. All right. On that note, we've had a good long session. I think hopefully for people that struggle with proportion, of which I am one, that this idea of fixing the proportions with just a simple stick figure and then building your structure and your volume and your anatomy, hopefully this idea is useful to you. And you can see how even at this simple stick figure stage, you're still expressing gesture. So, this has, I think, fewer lines than a lot of gesture drawings that I see other artists doing. But I also see some people whose gesture drawing is simply a sweep. It's a line of action and that's it. So this is more than a line of action. It's less than a scribbly gesture drawing. And I would say that if you struggle with proportion, maybe play with this approach. See if it's useful to you. See if it's helpful. Suretsy said to John, he says, "You're a better man than me to want to go overseas to do animation like that." I think if I can look at myself like 18-year-old Jeremy, fresh out of high school. If he had been given the chance to go over, instead of going to college on an athletic scholarship, if he had been given the chance to just go to Japan and work at, not even Studio Ghibli, but just work at whatever like hack animation sweatshop overseas, I think my parents would have been really pissed, but I might have taken that over going to college. And I'm not saying that would have been a good choice that would have landed me someplace healthy, because I certainly don't speak any Japanese. But I think it just would have been an adventure. And this comes from somebody who now says, I don't want to be an animator. But I think at that young age, with that much energy, I would have said, screw it, let's go, let's do it. So, all right, guys. Big screen, big screen, big screen. Here we go. All right. Thank you so much for being a part of our community, for hanging out, spending time. As I have mentioned before, we do something called Artist Office Hours, formerly Art Book Study Group. It's where we do deep dives some of the best art books around. But more importantly, we get on a Discord server. It's a Patreon exclusive live stream. And we have a voice channel on the Discord server. So as opposed to typing in the chat, you can just hop on and we can just have a conversation while drawing. You can share work in the Discord channel if you want me to do drawovers. We can go deeper back and forth into what we're doing this while I'm just drawing and doing studies for some art books and sharing more of my personal educational process and how I learn and grow. You can get access to that for as little as $2 a month. Head on over to patreon.com/Jeremy. It's patreon.com/GERIMI. we have a live session tomorrow night, Monday, 7:30 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. So if you're able to make that, head on over to Patreon, sign up. It's just $2. In fact, there's a free trial. You can get a free 7-day trial. So you should be able to get in just to join for the art book study group. Get in, hop on, hang out, and you will, if you miss the live stream, there's an archive of all the previous ones. You can see all the sessions we've done before. Check those out. And as I've said before, you get access to an online archive. You can read my comic books digitally. So please join us over there. Patreon.com/GERIMI. And if you would like to get a free digital sketchbook, work in progress animated GIFs about what I'm reading, what I'm watching, blog posts about what I'm reading, what I'm watching, what's inspiring me creatively, you can sign up for my free monthly newsletter, newsletter.jeremy.net. And if you would like physical copies of my comics, by the way, I don't say this enough. Before I go on with the comic stuff, hit that like button. If there's somebody else you think would enjoy these videos, hit that share button, forward it on, help spread the word. I greatly appreciate it. It's always nice to have more people joining us. All right. If you'd like to purchase physical copies of my comic books, we're free digitally on Comixology or Kindle. Go to amazon.jeremy.net. You can pick up books like my first graphic novel, Eye of the Gods. I'm the artist, writer, penciler, inker, gray toner. The whole thing is me. I did everything but push it through the printing press. This book is a psychological thriller about a man cursed with visions he cannot control. Then there's my most recent project, Morningstar. It's a retelling of Lucifer's fall from heaven as a Western. It's an 8-issue series. Volume 1 contains issues 1 through 4. Volume 2 contains the conclusion, issues 5 through 8. So both volumes have extensive back matter. There's script excerpts, photo reference, thumbnails, page layouts, character designs. I show you basically how I put the entire comic book together. So, and there are book flip throughs. If you go to the homepage of my YouTube channel, scroll down to the flip through section. I just have the camera above and I flip through the books so you can see what's inside before picking them up. All right, guys. Again, I love hanging out with you guys. It's always good to see you, spend time with you. I appreciate all the great comments, all the great feedback. It's always good to see you. Let's see here. Haha. Omar's in the chat. It says, sorry, I couldn't see. I've got a problem with my vision. I am very sorry to hear that. I hope your vision clears up soon, or that is something that's not a long-term vision. Let's see here. All right. James says some good comics to read. Thank you, James. I appreciate that. Paul says, great stream. Cheers. Thank you, Paul. Greatly appreciate it. All right, guys. That's it for now. Go be creative.